All right, let's get real about API testing. Are you still writing assertion after assertion for a single endpoint? Yeah, there's a much smarter way. Today, we're going to dive into the one technique that really separates the pros from the rookies, validating your API responses using JSON schema. You know the feeling, right? You push a new build, everything looks good, and then boom, the UI just breaks. What's the culprit? 9 times out of 10, it's some tiny, unannounced change in an API response. An integer suddenly became a string, or a field you depend on just vanished. It's the absolute worst kind of bug because it's so frustrating and honestly, completely avoidable. So, what do most of us do? We fall back on the old way. We write line after line after line of assertions, checking every single field one by one. It's brittle, it's a nightmare to maintain, and it's just plain slow. But now, look at the smart way. We're talking about validating the entire structure of that response in a single, beautiful line of code. It's a total game changer. Yeah, that old one-by-one method? That's what we call a brittle test. And it's a trap. Every time a developer refactors something or adds a new field, your tests shatter. And you're stuck picking up the pieces, fixing assertions instead of, finding actual important bugs. It's just a massive time sink. But wait, here's where it gets really interesting. The best engineers figured something out. They realized they were playing the wrong game. They stopped chasing every little piece of data and started testing something much more fundamental. They started testing the contract. So what in the world is this contract? Well, think of it like a blueprint for a house, right? Before anyone even thinks about pouring concrete, there's a detailed blueprint that the builder, the plumber, the electrician, everyone agrees on. For our APIs, that blueprint is the JSON schema. Okay, so what is it really? JSON schema is basically the rule book for your JSON data. It's the official document that says, hey, the user object must have an ID field, and it has to be an integer. The email field is required, and it has to be a string. It lays out all the rules, all the constraints. It becomes the undisputed single source of truth. In this analogy, just maps perfectly. The blueprint's overall structure, that's your JSON object structure. The specs for each room, bedroom, kitchen, those are your required fields. The building materials, wood, steel, concrete, those are your data types, like strings and integers. And the inspector, who comes by to make sure everything was built to code, that's your schema validator. Simple as that. Okay, so it's a nice analogy, but why should you actually care? How does this change your day-to-day work? Well, because this blueprint, it's not just a document. It becomes a massive safety net for your entire application. Let me show you what I mean. Just look at this. This chart tells the whole story. The amount of effort you spend maintaining tests with all those manual assertions, it's through the roof. But when you switch to schema validation, that effort just plummets. And we're not talking about a small improvement here. We're talking about getting hours of your life back, every single sprint. Your future self is definitely going to thank you for this one. Here's the bottom line. Schema validation becomes your absolute #1 defense against API regressions. If a developer accidentally changes a number to a string, your build fails instantly. You catch it right away. It forces data to be consistent across the board. And, this is huge, it stops one microservice from accidentally breaking another with a silent, unexpected change. All right, enough theory. Let's see this thing in action. And trust me, you've got this. It's way simpler than you might think to get this up and running in your own code. It really just boils down to 4 steps. 1, get your hands on the schema definition file. Usually you can just grab this from the API's Swagger or OpenAPI docs. 2, pick a validation library for whatever language you're using. 3, make the API call, just like you always do. And 4, instead of a dozen assertions, you just have 1. Assert that the response matches the schema. That's literally it. So if you're in the Java world using Rest Assured, this is just beautiful. Right after you check your status code, you add this one line. This one method does all the heavy lifting for you. It takes the entire response body and checks it against your schema file. It's clean, it's powerful, and anyone can read it. And hey, it's not just a Java thing. The concept is the same everywhere. Over in Python, you'd use a library like JSON Schema. You make your request, you get the JSON, and then you call one function to validate it against your schema. The language changes, but the core idea, validate the contract, stays exactly the same. Okay, now listen closely, because this is an insider tip you won't find in most tutorials. The top 1% of engineers, they don't just validate success responses. They validate their error structures too. They make sure that even when the API fails, it fails in a predictable, consistent way. This is absolutely critical for the front-end team to handle errors gracefully. Now, of course, with any powerful tool, there are a few common traps people fall into. So let's talk about the rookie mistakes so you can just sidestep them and look like a seasoned pro from the get-go. Okay, first big mistake, only checking the basics. A lot of people just check for data types and required fields, but they forget you can define so much more, like minimum and maximum values or even regex patterns. The second mistake is falling back into old habits, adding a bunch of extra JSON path checks on top of the schema validation, which just makes the test brittle again. But the biggest one, the one that almost everyone misses at first, is just blindly trusting the API documentation. This leads us to the biggest trap of them all, something I call documentation drift. It's when the code changes, but the docs don't. So your tests are happily validating against an old schema, giving you a green light while the actual API in production is already broken. This is why it is absolutely critical that your tests use the one true canonical schema file that the developers themselves are maintaining. It has to be the single source of truth for everyone. All right, we've covered a ton of ground here. So if you walk away with nothing else, I want you to remember these 3 things. Just 3 things. Number 1, your JSON schema is the contract, period. Treat it as the ultimate source of truth for your API structure. Number 2, it is your number 1 defense against regression failures. Think of it as an early warning system that's going to save you from so many headaches. And number 3, the pros validate everything. That means success responses and error responses. I'm serious. Take the time to learn this. Master this one technique, and you are immediately ahead of probably 80% of other QA engineers out there. It's truly the hallmark of a professional, modern testing strategy. And, this whole idea of a contract is so powerful, it actually leads right into our next topic, consumer-driven contract testing. That's where we take this idea and crank it up to 11. You're not going to want to miss that one. Thanks for tuning in.